The father of Dr. Kinley was George Edward Kinley, son of Henry and Elizabeth Kinley of Louisburg, Kentucky. While living in Kentucky, he was a sharecropper. The mother of Dr. Kinley was Ada Luvina Higgins Kinley, daughter of Benjamin and Nanny Higgins of Clarksville, Tennessee. She was part Cherokee Indian. George and Ada married and lived in Greenville, Kentucky. While there, they had 4 sons: Leonard, Benjamin Edward, Henry Clifford, and Joseph Eldon. In 1901, George moved to Springfield, Ohio, known as a Champion City, in search of work. When he applied for work at the Wickham Piano Plate Company, he was asked his name. Since he couldn't write, he said Kinley. Misunderstanding him, the individual writing for him erroneously wrote Kinnerly on the application. The family retained that spelling to this day. Only Dr. Kinley refused to retain the erroneous spelling and continued to use his original name, Kinley. George secured work there as a molder and later became a drayman. A dray is a low, heavy cart without sides used for hauling. After obtaining the job, he sent for his family of 5 to move from Greenville, Kentucky to Springfield, Ohio. He continued to work there till his death in 1937. After their move to Springfield, Ohio, they had 3 more children: Nida Bell, Elizabeth, and Robert George, totaling 7 children in all. They resided at 257 Buxton Avenue, which became known as the Homestead. On December 14, 1942, Dr. Kinley applied to the Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics for a special certificate of birth, which was used in recording births occurring prior to 1911, since no birth certificate was issued when he was born. He used 3 items as evidence, all witnessing to September 30th, 1895 as his birth date. They were Clark County, Ohio birth certificate number 58, issued on January 30th, 1923, a census record dated April 1st, 1930, and his application for a Social Security number dated November 27th, 1936. This building was a schoolhouse. Dr. Kinley started first grade here when he was 6 years old. The building currently contains Hebble's prescriptions. Dr. Kinley later went to school here and quit the 6th grade at this school in order to go to work. Dr. Kinley worked here as a molder off and on for many years. His father had worked here before him, and his elder son, Clifford, would later work here. Dr. Kinley also designed a system for this company. They said they'd pay him $1,000, but they never did. In 1930, he hurt his back while working here. Dr. Kinley was 18 years old here and is pictured with, as he put it, his running buddies. Dr. Kinley is on the right. Dr. Kinley's hobbies were horseback riding and boxing. At age 19, Henry enlisted in the military on July 22, 1915, in Company A, 9th Infantry Regiment, Ohio National Guard. Almost 2 years later, he received an honorable discharge on July 14, 1917. Katie Glenn and Henry Clifford Kinley married on March 27, 1916, in Springfield, Ohio. This is the home of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Glenn, parents of Katie Glenn Kinley, wife of Dr. Kinley. Years later, the same home of Dr. Kinley's mother-in-law, Mrs. Glenn. From left to right is Dr. Kinley, his wife Katie, and her brother Bob Glenn. When Dr. Kinley moved to California in 1958, Katie wanted to stay with her mother who was sick, so she moved in here with her mother. Here we see in Katie's handwriting a list which Dr. Kinley asked her to make of the family members with their birthdays. In the next 11 years, from 1917 to 1928, Dr. Kinley and Katie would have 8 children. Clifford, Richard, Katie, R.P. Otha, Arlena, Rachel, Glenn, and Jack. These are the 2 eldest sons of Dr. Kinley, Richard and Clifford, the firstborn. Both are imitating their father, who loved to box. This is the 4th child of Dr. Kinley. He lived from September 22nd, 1921 to October 19th, 1959, and would end up painting the original 40-foot chart under his father's direction. Richard was the 2nd son of Dr. Kinley. He died in 1924 of diphtheria, 1 week after turning 6 years old. His death caused Dr. Kinley to reflect upon his past life and the doubts he was experiencing. During the week after his death, Dr. Kinley was sitting on his front porch in his chair, leaning against the wall, while his dead son lay in a coffin in his house. He began to question the reason for his son's death, knowing that he had healed others but could not heal his own son. He questioned within himself whether he really had been called to the ministry at all. In so doing, he looked up to the heavens, picked a bright star, fixed his eyes upon it, and said, "God, if I am really called to be a minister, and you're not punishing me by taking my son, let that star fall from the heaven." The star promptly fell. Thinking it were a mere coincidence, he picked out another star, a little brighter, and asked the same question within himself. That star also fell. Apologizing within himself for his skepticism, he asked for another sign, and then he would never doubt again. He looked for the brightest star and asked the same question again. This star also fell. When the 3rd star fell, he fell over backward from his leaning chair. He would never doubt again that he was chosen by God to be a minister. While laying in bed one night with his wife Katie, who was pregnant with their son Glenn, Dr. Kinley saw an angel standing in the doorway and looking. He reached over to touch Katie, but he didn't. He looked back and the angel was gone. Mary Gross recalls when she first came to class that he started telling her the story, and she finished it by saying, "Don't touch Katie because she can't see the angel." He later told Mary that she was the angel he had seen, although this happened 4 years before she was born. At age 21, Dr. Kinley joined the Church of God and became known as the Bibliomaniac, with an ability to quote the Bible. He eventually became assistant pastor here at the Mount Calvary Fire-Baptized Holiness Church of God. He did have, however, a serious misgiving about their doctrine, for they taught that there were 2 works of grace. He wondered how, in fact, could there be works if salvation was by grace. In 1929, he was falsely accused by the congregation of an adulterous relationship with a distraught young parishioner whom he had been counseling. He was dismissed or put out and silenced from his church. After this, he became despondent and melancholy, wondering that there ought to be some way man would understand the purpose of God. For nearly 2 years, he would take his dog and his fishing pole, go to the creek, and sit there for long hours of meditation. He does not remember whether he ever caught any fish during these daily treks to the river, for his sole purpose for going there was to be alone and by himself, while contemplating there ought to be some way that God could judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he had ordained. In 1936, the lady returned to Springfield after living in California and exonerated Dr. Kinley. At age 35, on June 6, 1931, at approximately 9 a.m., Dr. Kinley had a panoramic vision and revelation in this house. While sitting in a rocking chair in the dining room, he lost consciousness. And, as like a Japanese fan opening, he saw the purpose, pattern, and plan of God from beginning to end, encompassing both Moses and John's visions. He awakened and was in a state of tears, for he did not understand what he had seen. His wife Katie and eldest son Clifford began carrying him upstairs to his bedroom, thinking he had re-injured his back. When they reached the landing, he blacked out again and was taken out of this world. It was this time that he received a revelation or understanding of the vision he had just seen. Yeshua's voice thundered in his consciousness, "Answer me, man. What will you do with what I have shown you?" The answer was immediately revealed to him, and he cried, "Teach your people your will, Yeshua." He later told his wife Katie, "I will never be the same man again," and he never was. William Davis was the first person Dr. Kinley tried to talk to about his vision and revelation. He became Dr. Kinley's first student. He's listed in the 1935 membership of the Kinley Divinity School, along with Gorman Bass, Carl Gross, Harvey Parsley, and others. He was also one of the first trustees. This is Carl F. Gross, a German Jew, standing in front of the home of Nida Bell Cox, Dr. Kinley's sister. Dr. Gross was among the earliest students in the school, sometime around 1932, and was eventually named the co-founder and international president of the Institute. At some point in time, between 1932 and 1935, a group of people gathered around Dr. Kinley and became his students. They called themselves the Springfield Interdenominational Bible Ecclesia. He did not hold any public meeting until a chart was painted. The first attempt by a neighbor, Harvey Parsley, was painted on the back of an oilcloth, but was unusable since the colors bled. The second attempt, done by Leroy Higginbotham on a bedsheet, resulted in the first elementary chart, finished in 1932. Both men painted under the supervision and direction of Dr. Kinley. This chart is still displayed today at the LA branch. The first public meeting place where classes of the Springfield Bible Ecclesia were held in 1932 or 1933. Frank Gross remembers going there for Sunday school when he was about 10 or 12 years of age. This building is now torn down. This letterhead of the Springfield Interdenominational Bible Ecclesia shows that by 1935, regular meetings were held on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays at 8 p.m., and Sunday school was at 11 a.m. Some of the officers and senior members were William Davis, Z.C. Barbie, Dr. Reverend G.W.C. Scott, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Gross, Harvey Parsley, Gorman Bass, Leroy Higginbotham, and of Dr. Kinley's relatives, his wife, parents, father-in-law, brother and sister-in-law, and 2 cousins. Ollie Higgins recalls that in 1935, she paid the fare for Dr. Kinley's trip to New York City. He went with his charts to see Father Divine, who became intrigued with his work. Dr. Kinley met with Father Divine alone in his office. There, Father Divine referred to himself as God. Dr. Kinley responded with, "I am God also." Father Divine declared back with a wink in his eye, "You are a smart man." Father Divine asked him to remain in New York City and work with him, offering him a large sum of money. Dr. Kinley refused and returned to Springfield. During the month of June 1935, the business meeting minutes of the unincorporated Ecclesia stated that Dr. Kinley wanted the group to become a divinity school rather than an ecclesia. The members of the Ecclesia moved that the new name would be the Kinley Divinity School. Member Reverend Dr. G.W.C. Scott helped with the reorganization, and a board of directors was appointed. On August 9, 1935, Dr. Kinley himself paid the $25 payment to the attorney for the incorporation of the Divinity School. On September 27, 1935, the members elected the officers of the Kinley Divinity School. Carl F. Gross as president, Dr. Leo Robinson, M.D., as vice president, Martha Baker as secretary, Z.C. Barbie as treasurer, William Davis as assistant pastor, and Reverend I.T. Derricott as foreign representative. Dr. Robinson helped write the first constitution of the Institute. The Kinley Divinity School was then incorporated on October 11, 1935, and filed on October 14, 1935, with its principal office in Springfield. Its trustees were Harvey Parsley, Martha Baker, Olive Higgins, Gorman Bass, and William Davis. As established with this business envelope, the Kinley Divinity School had its office and held meetings in Dr. Kinley's parents' home at 257 Buxton Avenue, Springfield. The following year, in 1936, Dr. Kinley moved to Cincinnati, where his son R.P. was living. Dr. Kinley eventually sold insurance during the day and worked in Laughlin, Ohio, for Wright Aeronautical Corporation as a custodian at night. He would wear his suit during the days to sell insurance, and then at night put on his coveralls over the suit to work at the aeronautical plant. The plant was one of the largest airplane plants during World War II, while Dr. Kinley worked there. On July 10, 1939, Dr. Kinley wrote President Franklin D. Roosevelt a beautiful and eloquent letter. He explained that there was a pattern of the universe and that he had a chart of 120 hand-painted pictures for its explanation. He further requested that since he was a financially poor man, perhaps FDR or some branch of the government or some philanthropic institution would be of assistance to him to further promote or advance his work. He therefore stated that he would like to meet with FDR or some other individual to explain this work, which encompassed 7 ages. The Smithsonian Institution responded to Dr. Kinley's letter on July 17, 1939, stating briefly that they had no funds available to aid him. In the late 30s or early 40s, the Kinley Divinity School rented this church in which to hold classes. It was located in a white neighborhood. They were forced to leave because the neighbors threw rocks at the building and broke the windows. Racism was playing its hand since both blacks and whites were attending the meetings. Currently, it is called Grace Baptist Church.
The students traveled from Cincinnati, Columbus, Springfield, and their respective areas to hold classes. Dr. Kinley is seated in the first row on the left. It was to these people that Dr. Kinley gave many predictions regarding World War II, including the exact date of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944. He told the Cincinnati class the date and then mailed the prediction in a letter to Carl Gross, president of the Springfield class. After mailing the letter, Dr. Kinley realized that the date was a day off, since 1944 was a leap year. He then mailed a postcard with the correction. Dr. Gross was confused because he received the postcard first. He then understood what had happened when he finally received the letter. In 1944, Dr. Kinley told them that FDR would not be in the White House 1 year after his nomination and election. FDR died April 12, 1945, of a massive cerebral hemorrhage 5 months after the election. Here from left to right, we see Prince Arzu, Willa Mae Kennerly, Bill McLean, Douglas Francis, Julia Francis, and Bob Kennerly. Prior to 1950, Dr. Kinley's younger brother Bob thought him to be crazy and took every opportunity to embarrass him. One time in the early 1940s, he invited this Prince Arzu from Nigeria to his home. Prince Arzu was president of the Executive Board of the American Council on African Education and in the Department of Public Law and Government at Columbia University. Bob thought he was the smartest man in the world. Bob also invited Dr. Kinley over, thinking the prince would outsmart his brother. The two men, Dr. Kinley and the prince, went privately into another room and spoke with each other for several hours. Much to Bob's chagrin and amazement, when the prince returned, he spoke of Dr. Kinley by saying, "Man, this is the smartest man I have ever met." Katie Kinley moved back to Springfield in 1942, and Dr. Kinley remained living in Cincinnati. His son R.P. and daughter-in-law Christine moved in with him at 503 Lincoln Park Drive along with their first child. In 1944, R.P. began painting the 40-foot chart under his father's direction. During this time, R.P.'s wife, Christine, was distraught over the mess in the house, having one child already and being pregnant with another. Dr. Kinley proposed to give her the exact date of the end of the war if she would let them continue to paint. Since the date was only a month away, she agreed, thinking she would only have to put up with it for another month. A month later, on May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies and World War II was over in Europe. Christine never again complained about the painting since his prediction was correct, and the chart was soon finished. On July 14, 1945, the Kinley Divinity School amended its Articles of Incorporation to change its name to the Kinley Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research, Incorporated. Dr. Kinley wanted this so that the people would not think he was trying to build another church established on old ritualistic doctrines under the disguise of a Bible class. It also changed its principal office from Springfield to Cincinnati. This was signed by its president, Carl F. Gross, and Secretary George F. Stenglein, and filed July 19, 1945. The following year, on July 14, 1946, the Institute held an annual meeting at the YMCA in Cincinnati, which lasted from 10:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. Its officers were Carl Gross as president, Fred Allen Sr. as vice president, George Stenglein as executive secretary, Lucille Farley as recording secretary, and Reverend Robert S. Kahn as director of education, Dr. Kinley as founder and dean, and D.A. Young as assistant dean. R.P. drew another chart for his father in 1946, which was copyrighted by the Kinley Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research, Incorporated. Here is Dr. Kinley and Brother Ben Kennerly at the Kinley Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research, located at 733 South Center Street, Springfield, Ohio. Dr. Kinley became acquainted with Francis Penkovic of Cincinnati, who called himself Krishnaventa. He claimed he was Christ and bled at the palms. He said he was from another planet which had floated too close to the sun and was dissolved. He was the only one to escape in a spaceship and came to the earth. His whole congregation was made up of wealthy widows from whom he had milked a fortune. He wanted Dr. Kinley's son, R.P., to paint some charts for him. Here he invited Dr. Kinley to speak to his group. In the foreground, from left to right, is Reverend Robert Kahn, the Institute Director of Education, Dr. Kinley, and Krishnaventa. He sent Dr. Kinley this photo. He signed the back of the photo with, "To my dear friend and companion in truth, I extend my heartfelt love and admiration, this hoping for continued unity of service." Prior to Dr. Kinley moving to Los Angeles in 1958, Krishna's congregation ran him out of town, and he ended up in Ventura County Hills, near Van Nuys, California, heading a group known as the Fountain of the World. The night the IDMR held its first class in Los Angeles on December 9, 1958, Krishna was blown to bits by a bomb. Notice Dr. Kinley's chart in the background on the left. Dr. Kinley received his honorary degree from this university. He had spoken with Dean Faulkner from this university for several hours. He sent a postcard from there to his sister, Nida Bell, in Springfield, saying, "We'll tell you and the rest of the faculty about Fisk University, which I think is of importance to our school and its success." This booklet was prepared for the Institute in Cincinnati and was called "Do You Know God? An Introduction to the Divine Pattern of the Universe" by Dr. Kinley, D.D., Ph.D. The manuscript preparation and editing was by Robert S. Kahn, the Director of Education. This booklet eventually was renamed and then reprinted by the Institute as the Panoramic Vision Pamphlet. Dr. Kinley is in the second row, fourth from the right. In 1947, he told the class that Russia would get the secret of the atomic bomb from the U.S. Russia's first bomb was in September 1949. Dr. Kinley is in the center second row. George Stenglein, the executive secretary, is seated in the first row on the right side. Notice the bottom of the chart, which contained chronology. This eventually wore off. Fred Allen Sr. is seated on the right. In mid or late 1950, a local Springfield newspaper ran this article stating that, quote, Dr. H.C. Kinley of Cleveland said that he accurately predicted the start of World War II in 1935. He said he predicted last May that the U.S. would be in combat before his return to Springfield. 3 weeks ago, he notified local friends of his approaching visit. World conflict, political and military, will continue until 1954, explaining that he makes his predictions from the Bible, end quote. This was Dr. Kinley foretelling the Korean conflict. On July 21, 1954, a peace treaty was signed at Geneva, Switzerland, dividing Korea into North and South. At the Springfield class request, Dr. Kinley prepared a manuscript for them. They'd requested something more complex, since the teaching seemed too simple. He consented and gave them a manuscript which ended up being too complicated for them to understand. In turn, they hired Professor Casey Lynn Sr. of Wittenberg University in Springfield to rewrite it in simpler terms for them to comprehend. This draft contract, dated July 3, 1950, states that he would edit the manuscript for a fee of $100. He was uneasy about his association with Dr. Kinley and required that no mention be made of his involvement, for it reads, "It shall appear that the manuscript made ready for publication is entirely the work of the expositor, Dr. Kinley." He was paid the fee, but never finished the job, saying that it was too difficult a task. In the second row left is Dr. Kinley, and second row right is William Farley Sr. In 1952, William Farley, brother-in-law to Mary Jo Harris, was dying of cancer of the lower bowel, and his weight had gone from 155 to 88 pounds. Farley's doctor, Dr. Robert Harris, pictured first row, third from the left, who was not a student in the institute at that time, did not expect him to survive, because his condition was so low, his eyes had rolled back into his head. He was unconscious, and a death rattle was in his throat. In fact, Dr. Harris had gone home, leaving instructions for the family to call him when, not if, Mr. Farley expired. Dr. Kinley was summoned by the family. He said he was going into Farley's bedroom alone, and no one was to come in, not even the physician. Dr. Kinley stood at the foot of the bed and said, "Farley, live." Farley's eyes opened, and he sat up. In the morning, he asked for a glass of wine when Dr. Harris returned. Farley would live for another 10 years, serving as a living witness of the power of Yahweh working through Dr. Kinley. On October 13, 1955, Dr. Kinley wrote a letter to his sister, Nida Bell, from Huntington, West Virginia, stating that he was disturbed about his job in the insurance business and the progress made in the school in the past years. He had been made manager over 7 states and had to travel constantly while headquartering in Huntington, West Virginia. It had been very hard, both physically and financially, to make a trip to Cincinnati and Springfield every 3rd Sunday of the month. On November 14, 1955, he therefore wrote his son, Glenn, in Cincinnati, that he had meditated on the subject of what steps he should take to manifest to the world that Yahweh was the sole instigation of the great vision and revelation. He responded by filing his resignation as manager of the Huntington Insurance District and devoting his attention full-time to the Institute. In the first row from left to right is Gorman Bass, a charter member, Robert Harris, Carl Gross, a charter member, Fred Allen Sr., and Dr. Kinley. In the second row from left to right is Bob Kennerly, Ray Carter, Wilbur Jack Carr, and William Farley Sr. On October 7, 1957, Dr. Robert Harris worked his usual Monday evening office hours from 7 to 9 p.m. in Lincoln Heights, Ohio. Concluding the workday, he began walking to his car and then remembered he had promised his mother, Mary Harris, a member of the Cincinnati branch since 1937, and his sister that he would attend a class which was next door to his office. As soon as he walked in, Dr. Kinley introduced Dr. Harris and asked him to give a lecture on childbirth. After he gave a 15-minute explanation, since he thought the audience was unlearned, Dr. Kinley concluded with an explanation of childbirth correlated to the tabernacle pattern and the migration of Israel, emphasizing blood, water, and spirit. Dr. Harris was amazed that the people seemed to understand. Afterward, Dr. Kinley said to him, quote, "We want you to come back because you've got something to say," end quote. The next Monday evening, Dr. Harris did attend class, and Dr. Kinley explained the pattern to the migration of the children of Israel. The next morning, Dr. Harris awoke and heard Dr. Kinley's voice within himself say, quote, "You've got something to say," end quote. The voice then explained how the migratory trek correlated to the process of digestion in detail. From then on, Dr. Harris attended the class regularly. Dr. Kinley with LeJune Gill. This is where he was living when he moved to California. Before the move to California, there were classes in Springfield, Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Urbana, and Lockland, Ohio. According to their business cards, there were 4 aims to the Institute at that time, which are our current 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th aims. Later, Dr. Kinley would expand and increase the number of aims, usually by pairs. The Springfield class of the Kinley Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research Incorporated published and copyrighted 3 lessons for a course of study called God, the Universal Spirit, an Archetypal Pattern of the Universe. Each contained 3 to 7 pages. Lesson 1 was called a prologue, which eventually became a portion of the preface to the textbook. Lesson 2 was called Vision. This was taken from the earlier pamphlet, Do You Know God?, and eventually became the Panoramic Vision pamphlet. Lesson 3 was called Revelation.
In August 1958, Dr. Kinley and others journeyed from Cincinnati and Springfield to California for the express purpose of getting the teaching into motion pictures, arriving on August 11, 1958. Staying at the Rookery Motel, 4937 Century Boulevard near Los Angeles International Airport, the group spent 2 weeks contacting various motion picture studios and producers for the purpose of having the teaching presented in the form of a screenplay. Each explained that it could not be considered for production until a scenario was written and that it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The group returned to Ohio in September. On the evening of September 1st, 1958, an announcement was made at the end of the Cincinnati class that Dr. Gross would be arriving at the Cincinnati airport with a message from Dr. Kinley. His announcement was that Dr. Kinley had requested that as many as could should move to Los Angeles. Within the next month in October, some 70 persons from the Ohio schools moved to Los Angeles. Some of the people pictured here were part of those 70 individuals who made that move. On October 6, 1958, the Kinley Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research reincorporated in California as the Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research. The initial trustees were Carl F. Gross, Dr. Kinley, and Virginia Carter. The address of the incorporators was given as 445 North Rossmore, Los Angeles, which was a hotel at which the group was staying. It was then called the Algiers Hotel. The place now is the Rossmore Retirement Home. Dr. Kinley, Dr. Harris, and others met with the scenario writer. The writer is the gentleman with the hat on the right. The meeting was on his home's rooftop. Here we see Dr. Kinley explaining the teaching from the Moses chart. Notice 4 other charts laid out on the rooftop. Dr. Harris also explained the teaching to the scenario writer, the goal being that he could write a scenario for the movie producers in an attempt to put the teaching on film. Some of the group went on a sightseeing trip for the day to Malibu. Pictured are Fred Allen Jr., Ray Carter, Mary Gross, Dr. Kinley, and Fred Allen Sr. Sometime in November or December 1958, through the efforts of a few, the Institute purchased a 6-bedroom house pictured here. It was to be used as a residence for Dr. Kinley and other class members. For approximately 2 or 3 years, the Institute also rented property at 2226 Virginia Road and 2237 Wellington Road, both in Los Angeles, to house members. Eventually, Windsor Boulevard was sold, and the Institute purchased 3 buildings containing a total of 8 residential units. One unit at 3407 West 21st Street housed Dr. Kinley. Henry Armstrong, holding a boxing mitt, is presenting Dr. Kinley with a book he had written called God, Gloves, and Glory. He was the first triple pugilistic boxer in the world, meaning that he held 3 titles in 3 different weight divisions at the same time. He had attended classes for about a year or 2 and then went to St. Louis in an attempt to set up a church. Henry Armstrong knew Saul Gould, a Jewish movie producer, and introduced Dr. Kinley to him. Saul attempted to organize a production of a scenario for the Institute. It was through Saul that Dr. Kinley met Gerald Merton, a Jewish scenario writer. Sometime in November 1958, a location on Cahuenga Boulevard in Hollywood was secured for classes and an office. The Institute rented this building for 2 or 3 years until they outgrew the facility. Advertisements were placed in the Los Angeles papers announcing the first meetings on the West Coast of the Institute presented by Dr. Henry C. Kinley, who was the world's most accurate predictor of future events and foremost interpreter of God's prophetic timetable, which was based upon divine revelation. His topic was the divine pattern of the universe. Meetings were held on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 8 p.m., and the office was open Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. The aims were now extended to 6. This was a reception which was held after the first public meeting in California. Mary Gross and Gerald Merton are pictured in the center. Pictured here is Gerald Merton, a Jewish scenario writer who helped Dr. Kinley. He would tape part or all of a lecture by Dr. Kinley, have Mary Gross transcribe them, and then attempt to write on a certain subject in an attempt to produce a scenario, pamphlets and the like for the school. After hearing the lectures for some time, Mr. Merton decided he could not write what Dr. Kinley was teaching. He said it was too big a job for him. He said what he learned from it all was God is all in all, and that's all, and he didn't know how to break this down. Mr. Merton did edit the first pamphlet printed in California, entitled An Introduction to Divine Metaphysical Philosophy and the Divine Pattern of the Universe, which was a variation of the pamphlet Do You Know God? There are currently Mr. Merton's edited writings of Dr. Kinley's lectures being distributed. Dr. Gross, Dr. Harris, Gerald Merton, and Dr. Kinley are pictured here. During this time, all were working arduously to compile and complete a scenario. Dr. Kinley, sitting in front of the Moses chart in the Institute's classroom on Cahuenga Boulevard, Hollywood. In 1959, he said that JFK would be nominated and elected and assassinated in office. JFK was nominated and elected in 1960 and assassinated in November 1963. William Mann, a member of the Millionaires Club and a sponsor of Billy Graham, invited Dr. Kinley to his office in Hollywood. Fred Allen Jr. recalls driving Dr. Kinley, Burbank Mitchell, and Dr. Gross to his office. Dr. Kinley spoke with him for about 1.5 hours. Mr. Mann offered to sponsor or set him up as he had done for Billy Graham, for a profit of course. Dr. Kinley declined. Here is Dr. Gross teaching from the Moses chart at the office on Cahuenga Boulevard. John Patterson and Robert Henry were undertakers. Mr. Henry's wife, Betty, wanted to know about the spirit and soul that the dead body she saw in her husband's business did not have. She came to class occasionally. After the group's lengthy and tedious labor, the direction of their efforts changed from a scenario for a movie production to a book. The first edition of the textbook was coming to its final stages in readiness for publication. On September 7, 1961, the Community News carried the story of the signing of the contract with the Institute and Great Western Book Publishing Company with Alfred Q. Jarrett, a principal in the firm. Seated are Alfred Jarrett and Dr. Kinley. Standing are Dr. Gross and Dr. Harris. Some of the article reads, quote, Jarrett is one of the few commercial Negro book publishers in the United States. He has more than 20 years' experience in the business. 250 persons packed the offices of the Jarrett's professional building in order to pay homage to Mr. Jarrett and to witness the signing of a contract by Great Western Book Publishers to publish a 635-page manuscript entitled God the Archetype, Original Pattern of the Universe, compiled and written by Dr. Henry C. Kinley, founder and dean of the Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research, Incorporated, end quote. The first edition of the textbook, God the Archetype, Original Pattern of the Universe, by Dr. Kinley, was finally published on October 10, 1961. This edition was a hardcover book. 18 days after the first public class in Los Angeles, Dr. Kinley had received a postcard signed only a layman, saying, "Read some Knights of Columbus booklets. They explain why John the 23rd is authorized while you are but merely tolerated by Almighty God. Give of your means instead of asking." Therefore, Dr. Kinley stated in the textbook that Pope John the 23rd would not see another Pentecost, being June 6, 1963. Pope John, being sick, asked all of the 550 million of his church to pray for his recovery. He died 3 days short of that, June 3, 1963, showing that Yahweh was endorsing Dr. Kinley and merely tolerating Pope John the 23rd. Pictured here are Dr. Gross, Dr. Harris, Herbert C. Holdridge, Dr. Kinley, and Alfred Q. Jarrett, the publisher. The book was sent to many ecclesiastical, scientific, and political leaders worldwide, including such religious leaders as Pope John the 23rd, Billy Graham, Norman Vincent Peale, and Rabbi Bernard Banberger, and such scientific leaders as Gunnov Gunderson, MD, President of the AMA, and such political leaders as President John F. Kennedy, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, President Gamal Nasser, and many other leaders, including kings and queens, Queen Elizabeth, Emperor Haile Selassie, and Emperor Hirohito. Of all the people who received the textbook, only 2 have the courtesy to acknowledge the gift. On November 14, 1961, President John F. Kennedy had a letter sent expressing his appreciation for our thoughtful courtesy for the gift of a textbook. On April 24, 1962, Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, acknowledged receipt of the textbook with thanks. Neither expressed any view, pro or con, as to the merits of Dr. Kinley's work. The distribution of the book had almost immediate effect upon religious, political, and scientific organizations. Through the efforts of Alfred Jarrett, the publisher, the textbook was received by the World Council of Churches during its 3rd General Assembly in New Delhi, India, in November 1961, where 2 powerful agencies of Christianity, the World Council of Churches and the International Missionary Council, were merged. In fact, Mr. Jarrett stated that he saw our book lying on a table at the International Council of Churches held at New Delhi. The article states, "The light shines in the darkness," was the devotional text. Metropolitan Yohanan Mar Thomas of the Syrian Church of Malabar said, quote, "We have come together in this place out of many nations, because Christ, who is the light of the world, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. We confess that we have walked in darkness rather than in light, that we have hidden from men the true light of the world because our works were evil." End quote. Pope John the 23rd likewise called for a general council of the Roman Catholic Church. The Second Vatican Council, the 21st Council of that church, convened in Rome on October 11, 1962. It was originally called for the purpose of, quote, "opening up the doors of the church, letting some fresh air in, and to bring the church up to date," end quote. When the council concluded its work in December 1965, it had rescinded and torn down nearly every tenet and doctrine upon which the Roman Catholic Church had stood for nearly 2,000 years. Shortly after its distribution, an article appeared in the paper stating that Dr. Kinley compiled one of the most revolutionary books on the Christian religion ever written. The book has been banned or refused in almost every library in the United States. Further, it states, their typesetters in London, England, where most of their books are printed, threatened to go on strike rather than set the type for the book. As a result, after keeping the book in the London plant for almost 1 month, they returned the book to the publishers and would not touch it. The publisher found another typesetter in California. The Herald Dispatch ran an article stating, author of world's most controversial book, Dr. Henry Clifford Kinley, seated, author of God the Archetype, Original Pattern of the Universe, discusses points in book with co-authors Dr. Carl Gross, left, and Dr. Robert Harris, MD, right. The book has created a storm throughout the world. Banned from the public libraries in Los Angeles, the book is on sale at the Herald Dispatch Library. Assistant pastor of the Church of Christ, LaSalle Williams, had challenged Dr. Kinley to a public debate as to whether physical baptism was essential for salvation. On December 9 and 10, 1963, at 8 p.m., LaSalle Williams had arranged the debate between Dr. Kinley and R.N. Hogan, minister of Figueroa Church of Christ, 455 West 57th Street, Los Angeles. LaSalle Williams had been in the ministry with the Church of Christ for 28 years and had been Reverend Hogan's assistant pastor for 7 years. Reverend Hogan was to defend that the scriptures teach that baptism in literal water of the penitent believer is essential to one's salvation from past or alien sins, and oppose that the scriptures teach that the alien sinner is saved without water from past or alien sins. It was agreed that each speaker would have one 45-minute speech, followed by a 30-minute rebuttal of the other. LaSalle and Dr. Kinley agreed that whichever one lost would bring their congregation to the other. The people themselves were the judges. At the last minute, Reverend Hogan became ill, and Reverend Moore took his place. During the debate, Reverend Moore, a well-educated man, mocked and ridiculed Dr. Kinley because of his grammar. 6 months later, Reverend Moore ended up in a wheelchair and later died. LaSalle told Dr. Kinley that he had lost the debate but won him. Dr. Kinley told him to return to his congregation and to teach the truth to people. On doing so, his congregation called the police and had him arrested and jailed for disturbing the peace. He was then rejected by his congregation and family, all of whom he had loved dearly. LaSalle Williams is today a member of the Institute and Board of Trustees, realizing the truth is taught here. During the 60s and 70s, Dr. Kinley would spend the winters in Los Angeles and the summers in Springfield. Here, he is teaching in front of the original 40-foot chart at the class in Los Angeles, located at the Baker's Union Hall, 1040 South Grand.
Amazing grace, how sweet, sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost,
Yahweh that is in me that is giving the vision. I think I told you that a couple of times before.
In 1966, the Institute would start to form branches outside of Ohio and California. Willie Jones left the LA class to start a class in Birmingham, Alabama. Dewey McCoy left the LA class to start a class in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1967, Edward Mixon left the LA class to start a class in Detroit, Michigan. Pictured here in Detroit are Beryl Brewington, Robert Harris, Dr. Kinley, and Edward Mixon during a visit by Dr. Kinley in 1967. In the second row left with glasses is Clifford Kinley, Dr. Kinley's eldest son. In 1944, when Clifford was working as a molder at Parker Pattern or Sweeper in Springfield, he was seriously burned with hot metal when a ladle of molten metal burst and poured down the inside of his shirt. Over 90% of his body was critically burned from his neck to his toes. The doctors expected he would die, but Dr. Kinley said he would not. Clifford did live a normal life after receiving 63 skin grafts. He died in December 1973. Dr. Kinley, in the red coat, and Mary Gross, on his left, are at the Detroit class during a visit there in the early 70s. During 1967, Fred Allen Jr. and Burbank Mitchell handmade a scale model of the tabernacle. Frequently, they would ask Dr. Kinley for more detail on its construction. The finished product was then taken to the 1967 convention. Prior to the 1967 convention, Dr. Kinley foretold in Springfield the day-by-day progress in detail of the six-day Israeli-Arab 67 war before it occurred. The Institute held its first international convention at the Salvation Army Hall on West High Street, Springfield, Ohio. It lasted from July 14th to July 23rd, 1967. Dr. Kinley had by then increased the aims to 8. There were approximately 300 delegates from 5 states, including Ohio, California, Alabama, Arkansas, and Michigan. There were organizational business meetings on 7 of the mornings. They covered convention conduct, progress reports from the state branches, evangelism, problems of state schools, responsibilities of state schools to the national body, financial business of the national body, and financing of the second edition of the textbook. Classes or spiritual sessions were held in the afternoons and evenings. Dr. Kinley spoke at the end of each class. Many say it was a convention never to be repeated, and in fact, during the convention, Dr. Kinley stated that it was his convention. Dr. Kinley told them that he wanted no partying, that they were there for the spiritual sessions, and that they were to conduct themselves accordingly. It was at this convention that the true names of Yahweh and Yahshua were consistently used. During the convention, Dr. Kinley explained that Joshua, or Yahshua, had transmutated or astro-projected from Egypt to the burning bush, and that some lady had called him, saying she had seen him at the end of her bed. He then asked those to stand to whom he had appeared, advising them that they had better not stand if he had not appeared to them, since he knew to whom he had appeared. Some then sat down. Dr. Kinley had these books brought to all the convention sessions to be used to check out and prove other churches' doctrines. On the stage on the left is the model tabernacle made by Fred Allen Jr. and Burbank Mitchell. Bené Harrison came to the convention to teach the class members Hebrew. Dr. Kinley let him put his chart up. Dr. Kinley borrowed Mrs. Flora Hogan's cane to use as an illustration while explaining the trek of Moses during the Wednesday night session. During the explanation of Moses at the burning bush, he illustrated Moses throwing down his rod by throwing down Mrs. Hogan's cane to the ground.
Now this is Moses. This is Aaron's rod that he got. She still got it in his hand. The one that he went out there and got carried around for 40 years. See? And he still got it. And he didn't miss carrying it out there that day. You understand? Now he's a shepherd. Is that right? Right. See, he's a shepherd. See? They didn't have shepherd's staff. You see what I'm talking about? That hook on that, see? And right around in under that land, you see, and rescuing, you see? You see that? You see that? But what's that you got in your hand? You out there hurting, see? What's that you got in your hand? But he said, all right, read.
And he said, cast it on the ground.
Now, this is how the folks down in Egypt don't know. He said, cast it on the ground.
And he cast it on the ground.
And he cast it on the ground. Read. And it became a serpent. And Moses fled.
Mary Gross, Monta Mixon, and others saw the cane turn into a serpent when Dr. Kinley threw the cane down. There were two Moses charts, this one and an earlier rendition of our current Moses chart. These two were standing side by side, and Dr. Kinley would use both charts. Joe Hisey was stricken with a vision and a delusion. On Friday, the 7th day of the convention, when the doors opened for the afternoon session, Joe was already sitting on stage with his legs dangling off the edge. He was rigid and appeared to be in a trance. The class began, and Dr. Kinley was called as the speaker. He was speaking more powerfully than usual. Then suddenly, Hisey began making sounds and lay back on the stage with his arms outstretched. Dr. Kinley asked that Joe Hisey be escorted out. Dr. Kinley later explained what had happened to Joe, and at a business meeting warned the people not to laugh at Joe, since it could have happened to them. Burbank Mitchell's discourse had been an explanation of what would become the Aya, Asher, Aya chart pictured here on the blackboard. Dr. Kinley, during the convention, had truly displayed Aya, Asher, Aya to the General Assembly. After the lecture, Dr. Kinley asked those that had been healed to come forward and stand. This is Dr. Kinley at the end of the convention at Sister Nida Bell's. After the 1967 convention, Burbank Mitchell left to start a class in Syracuse, New York. He is holding the original tracing for the Aya Asher Aya chart. Here is Sandra Giragosian, one of his first students. She has a PhD. She is presently the chairperson of the correspondence course. Dr. Kinley visited New York and Canada in 1969. First row, Lillian Collins and Dr. Kinley. Second row, Sandra Giragosian, Earl May, Alice Mitchell, Mary Gross. Third row, Aldine May, and Billy Carroll. Billy Carroll also left after the 1967 convention to start a school in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Kinley visited this class in 1969. Pictured are Dr. Kinley and Mary Gross on the way from New York to Canada. Billy Carroll, Dr. Gross, and Dr. Kinley are pictured here doing a visit to the school in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Rosa Mortier is pictured here with Dr. Kinley. She returned to her homeland, Belgium, after the convention and translated pamphlets into Flemish and French and continued on in the teaching. The body tabernacle chart was painted by Dr. Gross under the direction of Dr. Harris between 1967 and 1969. Alfonso Macklin left L.A. in the late 60s to start a class. Seated is Jean and Ma Bradley. In row 2 is Rita Jameson Rosen, Dolores Jameson, John Holcomb, Opal Holcomb, and Diane Brown. In the back is Roxanne Jameson Gross, Miss X, and Janet Calvert. Here is Jessie Gibbons, Diane Brown, Alfonso Macklin, Janet Calvert, and Derek. The second international convention was held at the Statler Hilton, Los Angeles, California, from July 18th to the 27th, 1969. There were approximately 300 representatives from 7 states and Canada, including Ohio, California, Alabama, Arkansas, Michigan, New York, and Illinois. Special invitations were sent to 500 dignitaries in the religious, scientific, and political spheres. By this time, Dr. Kinley had increased the number of aims to 10. Our current 8th and 9th aims were added.
Yahshua the same today as yesterday. Now I know I can...
Bishop David Short was a member of the Board of Trustees and had served in a variety of positions in the Institute and was a close associate of Dr. Kinley. Before coming into the teaching, he had founded and became the first Archbishop of the Orthodox Christian Spiritual Faith Church of Kansas City, Missouri. He held a Bachelor of Theology degree from Morningside College, Sioux City, Iowa. He was also an ordained Baptist minister and appeared in the 1950 Who's Who in Colored America. Dr. Kinley is holding the second edition of the textbook, Elohim, the Archetype Original Pattern of the Universe, which was introduced here at the 1969 convention. The true names of Yahweh, Elohim, and Yahshua were now in the text. Once again, it was sent to political, scientific, and religious leaders. 4 acknowledgments were received this time from President Richard Nixon, Dr. Ralph Bunche of the Ford Foundation, Emperor Haile Selassie, and the Los Angeles Public Library.
It's so plain to see. I'm so glad that he's chosen me. Yes, yesterday. Salvation seems so far away. Now we know that Yeshua is here today. Oh, I believe in Yeshua. Tell me why they just cannot see. I don't know. No.
Dr. Kinley also used a shepherd's staff, which was brought with them from Los Angeles.
The vision is so very plain to see. I'm so glad that he's chosen me.
Here is Dr. Kinley during the '69 convention with those of his brothers and sisters who adhered to the teaching. From left to right is Nida Bell Cox, Bob Kennerly, Elizabeth Nicholson, and Ben Kennerly.
But now we know that Yeshua is here today. Oh, I believe in Yeshua. I believe in
After serving 53 days shy of 40 years as founder and dean of the Institute, Dr. Kinley appointed Dr. Harris as dean on April 14, 1971, while on a trip to Big Bear, California. He explained to Dr. Harris that it was time to have one at the head of the organization that had the academic credentials that the world looked at in determining the credibility of a person or doctrine. Dr. Kinley wrote a letter to the schools announcing this on May 7, 1971, saying, quote, "I need not remind you that I am still founder of the Institute, and I can never be displaced from this office. Furthermore, I'm still Dean of the Universe, if you can understand what I mean by that statement." Nevertheless, Dr. Harris will henceforth assume the responsibilities of the office of Dean of the Institute, and you will hereafter contact him regarding all matters that you formerly brought to me. I'm still available for spiritual counseling, but I do not wish to be bothered anymore with personal problems, marital difficulties, and the like. End quote. The Third International Convention was held at the Beverly Hilton, Beverly Hills, California, from July 16th to July 25th, 1971. There were approximately 700 delegates attending each session from Ohio, California, Alabama, Arkansas, Michigan, New York, Canada, and Illinois. In row 1 is Darrell Kinley, Leonard Snellbaker, John Zink, and Willie Jones. In row 1 is Ronald Griggs, Dennis Drillard, Dr. Gross, Dr. Harris, and Bud Wunsch. In row 2 is Gary Mathis, Mary Gross, Dr. Kinley, and Wilbur Trainum. In row 1 is Bud Wunsch, Dennis Drillard, Dr. Gross, Dr. Harris, and Kerry Woodland. Dr. Kinley is behind Dr. Gross and Dr. Harris. Here's Priscilla and Glenn Kinley, Richard Carr with the back of T.C. Carter. Dr. Kinley had not spoken at all during the convention until the second to the last session. He then took the last portion of the class.
He told me, Moses asked him when he was going to be. And what did he say to Moses? Certainly, I will be with you. Now, the folks haven't caught up with that yet. Now, do you know the reason why he told his disciples after he was born to the loins of the Virgin Mary? In Matthew 19:28, 19, and 20. He said to them, go in all the world or all the age. Now straighten that world business up. Go in all the age. Now you have the ages over there on that chart over there. And preach to God. Would you mind reading that? I just want to show you that we don't pay no attention to what we read.
Matthew 28:19 and 20.
That's right.
Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age.
Now you see, when he went down into Egypt, he told Moses what to tell Pharaoh and him.
Right.
Tell him everything I've commanded you to tell him. You follow?
Yeah.
Now then, in order to fulfill that, after he comes out of the grave, you see, he tells them to go in the name of the Father.
Okay.
Now, you haven't been too long learning what the name of the Father was.
That's right. That's right.
And of the Son. And of the Holy Spirit. And lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the age. Now what I want to say is, here I am. And I want to let you know that I know what my purpose is. That's right. I knew it back in the realm of eternity and declared again from the beginning. You understand? Yes. And I've been right along all the time. And it's wonderful when you can get something definite, something positive, something basic, something concrete, something irrefutable and undeniable by anybody.
The General Assembly applauded for 5 to 10 minutes after he said, "Here I am." Many thought the lights in the room increased in their illumination. He then proceeded to lecture the entire last session. At the 1971 International Convention, the matter of an ecclesiastical peace mission was discussed. The Board of Trustees turned to the members of the Institute for contributions. The estimated cost was approximately $22,000. The members contributed $25,000. In early October 1971, the delegates embarked on their mission. The 12 delegates were Dr. Kinley, Dennis Drouillard, Dr. Carl F. Gross, Mary Gross, Belinda Gross Washington, Pamela Gross Duncan, Dr. Robert Harris, Elba Hobbs, Ben Kennerly, Gary Mathis, Burbank Mitchell, and Wilbur Trainham. The first meeting was in London on October 4th, 1971, with Reverend Michael Moore, General Secretary, Council of Foreign Relations, Church of England. When institution and fulfillment was explained, Reverend Moore got up abruptly and said he had to leave, stating, "Our doctrine has not brought peace. How can yours? May God bless all of you on this trip." Here, in reaction to that statement, Dr. Gross, normally a meek and mild individual, lit into Reverend Moore, saying, "We are accountable as ministers. This man is Yahweh, manifested in a body." Reverend Moore said he could not send us a report, and that he would have to report to Dr. Michael Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England and Primate of England. The next meeting was on October 7, 1971 in Cairo, Egypt, with Youssef Kamel, Comptroller General of External Affairs of the Ministry of Information and Culture, and with Moya Shukri of the same office. Periodically, they both asked questions throughout the discourse, one of which was whether Egypt would win if they went to war again with Israel. Dr. Kinley told them that they would not. There are 70 Jewish families living in a ghetto in Cairo. This room is under the church in the ghetto. While visiting there, Dr. Kinley made the statement that he laid there as a child and that the location of the church is the correct location of Yahshua's childhood home. The tetragrammaton was located around the walls near the ceiling. The coordinator could not arrange a meeting with King Hussein, but they did meet with Peter Salah, Director of Press and Public Relations, Ministry of Culture and Information, and Morawid Tel, Personal Secretary to the King. A textbook and Holy Name Bible were given to them. The delegation then had to fly to a non-Arab country before they could enter Israel, even though Israel is a stone's throw from Jordan. Dr. Kinley quoted Acts, the 17th chapter here. Here is Dr. Harris, Brother Ben Kennerly, and Dr. Kinley. Here is Burbank Mitchell, Dr. Kinley, and Wilbur Trainham climbing the ruins of the Acropolis. This is Brother Ben Kennerly, Burbank Mitchell, Dr. Harris, and in the back, Wilbur Trainham at the top of the Areopagus, or translated Mars Hill, which is opposite the western end of the Acropolis. Dr. Kinley did not climb this rocky height, saying, "I've been there. I've seen this before." Here you see Dr. Gross, Dr. Harris, Dr. Kinley, Wilbur Trainham, Brother Ben Kennerly, and Gary Mathis. Elba Hobbs is in the back. Here is Dennis Drillard, Dr. Kinley, Brother Ben Kennerly, and Gary Mathis on top of the observation tower in Tel Aviv, Israel. The delegation had arrived in Israel on October 12, 1971. While waiting for appointments to be arranged, the delegation toured Tel Aviv and Jaffa. Here on top of Mount Moriah is the Jewish Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. The top of the Muslim dome of the Rock Mosque is above and behind it. Dr. Harris, Burbank Mitchell, and Dr. Kinley are on the path between the two. On October 14, 1971, the delegation met with Michael Preguy, Chargé of Ecclesiastical Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He asked Dr. Kinley to summarize in a sentence or two the whole scope of the Institute's teaching. Dr. Kinley replied that it was impossible to do so, but did give a condensation of the vital and essential points of the teaching. The presentation was limited to 20 minutes. Mr. Preguy did promise to convey everything that was said to Prime Minister Golda Meir and Foreign Minister Abba Eban. Dr. Kinley had made the statement that there is volcanic activity under the dome. This is Mount Moriah, also the former site of Solomon's Temple, Zerubbabel's Temple, and Herod's Temple, and today is referred to as the Temple Mount. Here from the top of the Mount of Olives, Dr. Kinley faced across the Kidron Valley containing the Garden of Gethsemane to the facing Mount Moriah and Jerusalem. He raised his hands and quoted Matthew 23:37, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not." Yahshua truly did return to the Mount of Olives, only this time he came in a Mercedes-Benz, and the people missed him again. On October 16, 1971, the delegation met at the Vatican with Pontiff Joseph Cardinal Gramillion, chairman of the Pontifical Commission for Justice and Peace. When the elementary chart was being enrolled, the cardinal said, "I see that you use the true name of the Heavenly Father, Yahweh." Although only 53 minutes were allowed, Dr. Harris explained Yahweh's vision given to Dr. Kinley, the true names, the pattern of the tabernacle, and institution and fulfillment. Dr. Harris ended by stating that all of the Christendom was wrong, as they're still practicing carnal ordinances. Pontiff Gramillion remarked that Dr. Harris had given a clear presentation of the teaching. After the presentation, Pontiff Gramillion asked for and was given the location of the Institute's headquarters and each branch school. After the meeting with Pontiff Gramillion, Dr. Kinley gathered the delegation in the hotel and warned the group that their physical lives were in jeopardy as a result of the Vatican meeting. He also said that any attempt to harm any of them would bring down the curtain. On October 20th, 1971, they arrived back in Los Angeles. Dr. Kinley requested that all the ministers, rabbis, ecclesiastical leaders, and their congregations be invited to an ecumenical biblical reconciliation of the ministry, as in 2 Corinthians 5:18. The 3 reconciliation sessions were held from 7 to 10 p.m. August 8th, 9th, and 10th, 1972 at Weaver Chapel, Wittenberg University, Springfield, Ohio. On July 28, 1972, 300 invitations were sent out to all the ecclesiastical leaders in the Springfield area. Of these, only 1 actually attended a session. 67 members of the Institute's 16 branches outside Ohio attended the meetings.
On the personal side of Dr. Kinley, we see Dr. Kinley, Mary Gross, Pamela Gross, Belinda Gross, Roger Jackson, and Burbank Mitchell going to class in Los Angeles. Mary Gross was Dr. Kinley's secretary, platonic companion, aide, cook, housekeeper, and hostess. Dr. Kinley had said that the happiest years of his life had been with Mary. His wife, Katie, to whom he continued to send half of his Social Security check after his move to California, had said that she could never have done for Dr. Kinley as Mary had done. Here is Dr. Kinley and Mary Gross at the time of her son's wedding. Dr. Kinley's sisters and cousin from Springfield came for a visit, and they all took an excursion to Knott's Berry Farm. We see cousin Ollie Higgins, Mary Holland, Mary Gross, Sister Elizabeth Nicholson, Dr. Kinley, and Sister Nida Bell. Here again we see Sister Elizabeth Nicholson, cousin Ollie Higgins, Mary Gross, Sister Nida Bell, Mary Holland, and Dr. Kinley. Dr. Kinley had a hernia surgery in the summer of 1970 at the community hospital in Springfield. Since he loved children, he asked to see Melissa Gross, Mary Gross's granddaughter, aged 6 months after his surgery. She was brought to him in the lobby of the hospital. Dr. Harris was present and witnessed the surgery. Upon opening up Dr. Kinley, he heard the surgeon remark that Dr. Kinley had the body of a young man, although he was 74 years old. At that time, they discovered that he had 3 kidneys. Dr. Kinley would play dolls with Melissa Gross. Here is Dr. Kinley with Melissa and Sherry Gross. Here is wife Katie and sister Nida Bell on Lexington Avenue, Springfield, Ohio, which was Katie's mother's home. Here is Sister Elizabeth and her husband Morris Nicholson at their home, which had been Dr. Kinley's parents' home and was referred to as the homestead. After he had the vision and revelation, he held house classes at this location in his parents' home. His mother had said to him, "Clifford, I gave birth to you, but I never knew you." Here is Sister Nida Bell Cox with, as she would say it, Brother Bob. Here is Sister Nida Bell's kitchen with cousin Ollie Higgins, Dr. Gross, Howard Brown, Brother Ben Kennerly, Dr. Kinley, and with Sister Nida Bell standing. This is Dr. Kinley, Mary Gross, and her daughter Belinda Gross Washington eating out. Here is Dr. Kinley and Sister Nida Bell in Springfield, Ohio. Here is Dr. Kinley and Mary Gross in 1973 and flight to the 4th International Convention in Denver, Colorado. The 4th International Convention was held at the Denver Hilton, Denver, Colorado, from July 1st to July 7th, 1973. By this time, there were many new branch schools, and attendance reached approximately 1,000 from Ohio, California, Alabama, Arkansas, Michigan, New York, Montreal, Hamilton, Canada, Illinois, Rhode Island, England, and Belgium. As a result of this convention, a branch was started in Denver, Colorado. By the time the convention began, a school also had been started in England by Carrie Woodland. Dr. Kinley did not personally speak at this convention. Some of the deans at the time of this convention were Row 1, Dewey McCoy, Little Rock, Rosa Mortier, Antwerp, Belgium, Leonard Snellbaker, Pomona, Dr. Harris, International Dean, Alfonso Macklin, Chicago, Don Embry, Detroit, Willie Jones, Birmingham. Row 2, Billy Carroll, Canada, Carolyn Angold Green, Kingston, Canada, Burbank Mitchell, Syracuse, Binghamton, Elmira, Rochester, and Hornell, New York. Roderick Channer, Hamilton, Canada, Kerry Woodland, England, and Oliver Gill, Springfield. Pictured is part of the International Board of Trustees and executive staff at the time of the convention. Row 1, Dr. Gross, Dewey McCoy, Leonard Snellbaker, Dr. Harris, Roger Jackson, Dennis Droulard, Willie Jones. Row 2, John Baxter, Billy Carroll, Burbank Mitchell, Gary Mathis, Edward Mixon, LaSalle Williams. Missing from the picture are Dr. Kinley, Mary Gross, Bishop Short, and Roland McCoy. In 1974, Aaron Bryant moved to New Orleans, Louisiana to start a branch there. In June of 1974, Richard Davis of the Springfield, Ohio class had been critically injured in a motorcycle accident. He laid comatose in a hospital with a severe head injury, broken nose, and fractured pelvis. Dr. Kinley came to his bedside at the hospital and, as Richard puts it, drew him back into his physical body. In a matter of days, he was completely healed and walked out of the hospital. While watching the news at home in early 1975, Dr. Kinley began telling Mary Gross about an incurable disease that would come in the end times that would originally start by sexual transmission. They would find it through the blood, and homosexuality was spoken of. He did not name the disease, but said that the doctors would not find a cure. The entire conversation flashed back into Mary's mind while watching a news show about AIDS in 1989. She then realized he had been explaining AIDS to her. The 5th International Convention was held from June 30th to July 5th, 1975 at the Statler Hilton in Washington, D.C. The General Assembly was now approximately 1,500 to 1,600 from Ohio, California, Alabama, Arkansas, Michigan, New York, Montreal, Hamilton, Kingston, Canada, Illinois, Rhode Island, Colorado, Louisiana, Georgia, Indiana, Mississippi, Missouri, New Jersey, Tennessee, Texas, Seattle, Washington, Belgium, England, and Nigeria. Just prior to the convention, Dr. Kinley had requested that the theme be Matthew 24:14-15. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached, and then the end shall come. It was then after this convention that the school began to multiply in number of schools. A school was started after the convention in Washington, D.C. Thousands of invitations were sent to political, economic, and religious heads of state, although none attended. Although Dr. Kinley did not personally speak, he sent word to the morning business meetings that it would be advisable to split the country into regions for purposes of any further conventions, since the amount of participants was getting too large. He also requested that the phrase, "the dragon," be added to the 7th aim, and directed that certain changes be made to the Moses, ages, and dispensations, and carnal ordinance charts, and called our attention to the fact that the court containing the altar of burnt offering and laver was called the court roundabout, not outer court. During the convention, it was also initiated for a second ecclesiastical peace mission to occur. Dr. Kinley also asked Michael Rothstein if he would like to go to Israel with the teaching. From August 7th through the 14th, 1975, Dr. Kinley was hospitalized for a complete diagnostic workup after a chest x-ray showed a condition of his right lung. He had complained of an intermittent fever, cough, and weakness. His doctors decided not to operate because of his profound weakness, his age, and his abnormal breathing capacity tests. After being released from the hospital, he was bedridden at home, remaining weak, but mentally alert and spiritually aggressive. Here is Dr. Kinley, Dr. Gross, and Dr. Harris on a weekend relaxation trip at San Luis Obispo. On October 9 through October 29, 1975, individuals completed the second ecclesiastical peace mission, lasting 21 days. The delegates were Dennis Droulard, Dr. Robert and Mrs. Marion Harris, Elba Hobbs, Brother Robert Kennerly, Clarence Keyes, Gary and Patricia Mathis, Burbank Mitchell, and Wilbur Trainham. Dr. Harris spoke for 2 hours at the first meeting, which was on October 13, 1975 in Tokyo with Kunio Sato, International Science Division, Ministry of Science and Culture, and Mr. Arai, Special Section of Religious Affairs. In Hong Kong, the delegates met with the managing directors of the Hong Kong Buddhist Association and of the Hong Kong Taoist Association. Their names were Reverend Kok Kwang and Tony Kwakwa. While in India, attempts were made to meet with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, but to no avail. The delegates were given 5 minutes with Mr. Haksar of the Ministry of External Affairs. In Israel, Dr. Gary Mathis spoke and focused on blood, water, spirit, and 40 with Michael Klein, representative of the Ministry of Religious Education. The following day, Gary Mathis explained Dr. Kinley's vision to Jonathan Prato of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On October 27th in Moscow, Dr. Harris, Burbank Mitchell, and Wilbur Trainham were invited to meet with Ivan I. Miklev, Director for International Communications, Council for Religious Affairs, and his deputy, Leonid V. Sherbakov. Mid-1975, Dr. Kinley asked David Rosen, a native Israeli, to return to his homeland, confirming to him that it was Yahweh who was telling him that he might one day go to Israel with the teaching. David and Pamela Rosen moved to Israel in October 1975, followed by Michael and Jerry Rothstein at the request of Dr. Kinley on January 11, 1976. Shortly after Dr. Kinley's death, a new orange soft drink came on the Israeli market called Kinley. There were commercials in Hebrew for it everywhere, on radio, TV, and billboards saying, "Things taste better with Kinley." The Rosens stayed in Israel for about 1 year, and the Rothsteins stayed for about 2.5 years. In compliance with Dr. Kinley's request, before their departure from Israel, a convention was held in Jerusalem in September 1977, producing about 120 visitors. During late 1975 and early 1976, Dr. Kinley was bedridden with a variety of ailments. On Monday, February 9, 1976, at approximately 8:25 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Dr. Kinley passed away. The cause of death listed here on his certificate of death, signed by Dr. Robert Harris, was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease due to a neoplasm of the right lung. On the day of his death, he was advised that the funds necessary to carry on the third peace mission had been raised. Funeral services were held at the Scottish Rite Masonic Temple on Wilshire Boulevard, Los Angeles, on February 12, 1976, at 11 a.m. Dr. Kinley had watched this building being constructed on the way to class. All of the marble had been brought in pre-cut from Italy. Dr. Harris officiated, assisted by Fred Allen Jr. and Dennis Droulard. Funeral services were also held in Springfield, Ohio, on February 14, 1976, at 10:30 a.m. at the Center Street YMCA. Dr. Oliver Gill officiated. The interment was in Ferncliff Cemetery, Springfield, Ohio, near his son, Richard.
5 months after Dr. Kinley's request for another peace mission, the Third Ecclesiastical Peace Mission embarked on March 22, 1976, and returned May 15, 1976, lasting 55 days. Once again, 12 delegates participated. Elfreda Allen, Mary Gross, Dr. Robert and Mrs. Marion Harris, Elba Hobbs, Bob Kennerly, Clarence Keyes, Gary and Patricia Mathis, Burbank Mitchell, Wilbur Trainum, and Closton Vaughn. Each individual they met received a Holy Name Bible and Dr. Kinley's book, Elohim, the Archetype Original Pattern of the Universe. The first meeting was in Sydney, Australia, with Reverend Alan Nichols, Director of Information of the Archdiocese of Sydney of the Church of England. Here we see a plaque on the wall where the delegation met in Manila. The plaque commemorated Pope Paul VI's visit there in Manila. The delegates had a meeting in Manila, the Philippines. Their meeting was with Monsignor Oscar V. Cruz and Reverend John Zwanipogi, substitutes for the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Sin. Here we see Dr. Harris, Monsignor Cruz, and Wilbur Trainum. Burbank Mitchell is in the background. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the delegates had 3 meetings. The first was with 5 members of the executive staff of the Evangelical Church McCain Jesus. 2 days later, there was an unscheduled meeting in Dr. Harris's room with Mr. Negrausi, the hotel's bell captain. At the conclusion of the lecture, he said, "I know that when you left home to go on this mission, that you did not have me on your list, but the Lord had said he would send me somebody here, and I see he has kept his word." Later, the delegates met with His Holiness, the Patriarch Abba Yohannes, and 4 officials of the Ethiopian Orthodox Union Church. The delegation had a layover in Cairo, Egypt. The next meeting was with His Eminence Roman Catholic Bishop Pierre Dubois, Vicar Apostolic of Istanbul, Turkey. Here we see Bishop Dubois, the interpreter, Brother Bob Kennerly, and Burbank Mitchell. And again we see Bishop Dubois, the interpreter, Burbank Mitchell, and Dr. Harris. The next day, the delegates met with the Very Reverend Jean Cholakian, Archbishop of Istanbul of the Armenian Catholic Church. The delegates next met in Geneva, Switzerland, the headquarters of the World Council of Churches. The delegation met with 7 officials of the World Council of Churches, along with Dr. S.J. Samartha, the head of the World Council office in charge of people of different faiths and cultures. The next meeting was in Copenhagen, Denmark, with Reverend Knud Wampelman, General Secretary of the Baptist Union of Denmark. Ireland, they met with the Very Reverend George Sims, Archbishop Armagh and Primate of Ireland of the Church of Ireland. In Brussels, Belgium, they met with Rosa Mortier. They later met with Dr. André Pieters, President of the Synod Protestant Church of Belgium. The group had to travel on the 16-seater plane from Brussels, Belgium to Bonn, Germany. In Bonn, Germany, they met with Bishop Anton Schoitz and Dr. Osterheld of the German Conference of Roman Catholic Bishops. In Paris, France, they met with Abbe Smith of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Paris. They also met with 4 representatives of the Protestant Federation of France. In Lisbon, Portugal, they met with José Baquela Oliveira, president of the Catholic University of Portugal, Manuel Costa Freitas, doctor of philosophy, José Nuez Carrillo, teacher of the Old Testament, and Antonio Augusto Tavares, teacher of theosophy. Unsuccessful in arranging a meeting with a cardinal of the archdiocese, they were able to meet with Padre Antonio Algara, vicar of the Archdiocese of Madrid, and Padre Tirso Vaquera Rojo. While in Portugal, the delegation traveled to see the site of the so-called Vision of Fatima. This vision became the foundation for worldwide religious, political, and economic governmental policies of this century. In Lagos, Nigeria, meetings were held with Prince Adolphus Onaye and Mr. and Mrs. Soji Cole, another passenger from the flight to Lagos. Dr. Gospel and Mr. Rainier and many young adults from the hotel. They also met with Roman Catholic Archbishop A.O. Akogi. In Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, they met with Roman Catholic Bishop Carl Joseph Romer and Father Thomas L. Cullen. Bishop Romer promised to forward the information to the Cardinal Archbishop. In 1983, Dr. Gross gave his written consent for his removal as international president. This was fulfilled on October 6th. The Board of Trustees then promoted Gary Mathis to the office of international president in November 1983. Dr. Gross was then elected to the newly formed position of President Emeritus, which he held until his death on January 12, 1988. In July of 1987, the 6th International Convention was held at the Los Anatole Hotel in Dallas, Texas. One purpose of this convention was to encourage greater communications between and among members of the 4 different regions. A communications gap had developed within the Institute since the passing of the founder, and the Institute seemed at times to be slipping into 4 separate organizations. The convention gave everyone a chance to visit on a personal level and see that the gospel was being preached with power and demonstration in the various regions. Daily, the attendance ranged from 4,100 to 4,500. In addition, there were new visitors at nearly every session, and some visitors returned for several sessions. Because of the vast throng in attendance, 2 huge projection television screens were used on each side of the stage so that everyone could see and hear. Due to this innovation, everyone had a good seat. Many said that this convention approached to the electricity of the 67 convention. The vision and revelation of Dr. Kinley was clearly demonstrated and explained. During the convention banquet, Sister Nida Bell Cox, Essie Ross, Mary Jo Harris, Annabelle Allen, and Mary Gross gave their testimonials. They had been members of the Institute for many years, had known Dr. Kinley, and had witnessed phenomenal and powerful events during their association with Dr. Kinley. Mary Jo Harris had been a member of the Cincinnati branch from 1937 to 1958, and then a member of the Los Angeles branch from 1958 until her death. Annabelle Allen had been a member of the Cincinnati branch from the early 1940s to 1958, and then likewise a member of the Los Angeles branch from 1958 to present. Essie Ross started class in Ohio and then moved to the LA branch. All were steadfast members of the Institute. Here is a map of the branches in the eastern region as of 1992. Currently, there are 21 branches in Canada, Washington, D.C., and 7 states, including Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia. There have been many regional conventions in the odd years beginning in 1977 to date, except for 1987. The 7 Eastern Regional Conventions have been held in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Richmond, and Baltimore. Here is a map of the branches in the southern region as of 1992. Currently, there are 50 branches in 11 states, including Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and also in the countries of Jamaica and Panama. The 7 Southern Regional Conventions from 1977 to 1991 have been held in Chattanooga, Raleigh, Nashville, Tulsa, Atlanta, Jackson, and Mobile. Here is a map of the branches in the northern region as of 1992. Currently, there are 33 branches in 7 states, including Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, and Wisconsin. The 7 Northern Regional Conventions from 1977 to 1991 have been held in Minneapolis, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Omaha, Peoria, Indianapolis, and Louisville. Here is a map of the branches in the Western region as of 1992. Currently, there are 23 branches in 6 states, including Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, and also the country of Mexico. The Institute today has internationally 131 branches with a little more than 5,000 members. The 7 Western Regional Conventions from 1977 to 1991 have been held in Fresno, San Jose, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque, Portland, Phoenix, and Sacramento. When Dr. Kinley received the divine panoramic vision and revelation, Yahshua asked him what he would do with what he had been shown. His response was, "Teach your people your will." Dr. Kinley steadfastly fulfilled that covenant by teaching and imparting the vision and revelation unto us. Words, therefore, are insufficient and cannot truly express our deep appreciation and gratitude for the great and wonderful deeds that Yahweh through Yahshua worked in him. By his great mercy and loving kindness, he has given us a profound understanding of Yahweh's purpose, his pattern and plan. Yahshua permitted Dr. Kinley to reveal unto us many marvelous facets of his purpose, some being the true names and title of Yahweh, Elohim, and Yahshua, the divine tabernacle pattern, the importance of the law and the testimony, the purpose of Yahweh, working line upon line, the fulfillment of the law and prophets by Yahshua, Yahshua being back with Moses, the understanding of both the Old and New Covenants, the realization of the ages and dispensations, the understanding of both the mystery of righteousness and the mystery of iniquity, the importance of Romans 1:19 and 20, and the gift of his Holy Spirit. As John said, there are also many other things which Yahshua did, the which, if every one of them should be written, we suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Our purpose was to show the mighty acts and deeds and the profound understanding that Yahweh has granted us by means of the divine vision and revelation given to Henry Clifford Kinley. Truly, we now know no man after the flesh. We are not seeking to glorify the flesh, but rather to praise, honor, and glorify Yahweh through Yahshua, his Holy Spirit. For he led us to know that, truly, Yahweh through Yahshua is the all in all.